Peace and blessings, family. We are now live here with having conversations with Brother Asar Imhotep. Glad you can join me this day on Sunday, July the 9th, 2017. We're here today to talk about and respond to some comments that were made by Dr. Wesley Muhammad on the Breakfast Club show and morning show out of New York on Power 105. There have been plenty of responses to his commentary, and he himself has made a response. But I felt that the responses that were made thus far by various people on the internet were emotional responses, and two, they did not hit on the core issues that his commentary raised. And so I wanted to take some time after everyone made their responses to hint on a few things that I did not see in their responses, and then, bring that and offer that to the discussion today. So I have put together some notes in PowerPoint fashion. So I will be switching the screen soon, and we will go from there. And so this particular discussion is broken up into two parts. The first part will be addressing the conversation that was had on the Breakfast Club, and the second half will address a few issues in the book Ra is Allah, Why Asar Imhotep is Wrong, written by Dr. Wesley Muhammad. Hopefully it isn't backwards on your screen when you see this. And so just a couple of things. I won't address the whole book and things of that nature, but just a few things based on some commentary coming from Dr. Wesley on his response to the backlash that he received from his commentary on the Breakfast Club. So I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible there. We have a lot to get through, so I won't waste any more time. I'm just going to get started. And I have my other computer up here. So if y'all have any questions or comments, hopefully I'll be paying attention, and I'll see them, and hopefully I'll be able to address them in a timely fashion. So without further ado, let me get started. So let me share my screen. And again, I want to thank all of you who are listening live, and thank all of those who are listening to the recording. Appreciate your time and attention, and would love your feedback. And I look forward to engaging you in the near future. So let me share the screen. Let me get the PowerPoint started. So I will wait to see if I can see it on the other computer and that everything is straight, and then we will get started. Okay. Everything looks a go. Peace to Christopher Cager, Brother Ini Hirit Kalfani, who are in the chat room, and then all of the other ones who have not said anything in the chat, but who are no doubt viewing this live. So the title of this presentation is called The Value and Vitality of Africana Studies, a Response to Wesley Muhammad. And the focus on Africana Studies is because of his commentary, which said that an African Studies and African History degree is a BS meaning, and excuse my language, a bullshit degree. And so not only that, he made the commentary that Africana Studies has very little practical value and in nation building skills. And so it's as if, you know, the focus isn't on nation building. So we're going to address his comments and other things in which I mentioned earlier. So we'll just get started. So first and foremost, I am Asar Imhotep, for those who don't know. I am trained in software programming and computer science. Matter of fact, I'm back in school for computer science, for an advanced degree in computer science. So I'm not speaking only simply as an individual who is engaged in Africana Studies, who is a participant in the expanding dialogue of Africana Studies, a presenter and author of Africana Studies. I am also one who is well-versed and trained in the STEM fields. And so my particular field is within the cognitive sciences, which is an interdisciplinary scientific study of the mind and its processes. And it is multidisciplinary, as mentioned, and these are the primary fields of inquiry for which comprise the cognitive sciences. So you have psychology, philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence, which is just computer science. And so if any of y'all ever use Google Translate, you know, that is the synthesis of computer science, linguistics, psychology, and anthropology. And so if you're talking about doing any kind of artificial intelligence, you know, building robots and things of that nature, one, you would have to know linguistics. Two, you would have to know anthropology, because you're trying to make them more human-like. And then, of course, psychology and things of this nature. And so philosophy helps guide the framework in terms of its possibilities, you know, the logic of it all. And so anybody knows who deals with computer science, is nothing but logic applied to the flow of electricity through certain circuits. And so just want to give you a little bit of background of who I am and what I deal with and why I think that I have some insight into this particular topic in which we're discussing today. So as mentioned before, Dr. Wesley Muhammad, promoting his latest book, which he argues that some new synthetic weed, or weed in general, is one, the creation of the government, the US government, in labs, and the result of its usage in terms of the weed makes men, especially black men, feminine and or homosexual. So that was fundamentally what he came to address, the topics in his book. I have not read that book, so I don't have an opinion on the merits of his arguments. However, within that discussion, there was a smaller discussion prior to him really getting into that subject, about the value of education as it regards to making money. And so this show, I don't know when it officially aired. I didn't hear the live interview, but the video was published on June 23rd, 2017 on YouTube. So you can just search, you know, Dr. Wesley Muhammad, Breakfast Club, the Breakfast Club, and you know, this video should pop up. So instead of playing the audio, I have transcribed the conversation so that, you know, you can pause the video in the future and see it. And then of course you can just go to the thing and hear it yourself. But there was a point in the video where the AY stands for Angela Yee, the WM for Wesley Muhammad, and DJ Envy is just DJ Envy. I spelled that out throughout. So Angela Yee says, you know, some kids say today that they don't need college because there are people that are successful that never pursued higher education. Wesley Muhammad responds, and that's true. Everybody doesn't need college. And the fact of the matter is most of us in college are pursuing BS degrees. BS is in bull S degrees because we're pursuing fields that aren't practical. DJ Envy responds, we'll talk about it. What are some of those degrees that some of them are pushing towards that you feel are BS? Responding to that specific question, Wesley Muhammad says, well, folks will get mad at me. DJ Envy says, let them get mad. And then Wesley Muhammad responds, but 4 years, $80,000 for an African history degree? That's not practical. We can get African history, we can get knowledge itself without incurring the debt. DJ Envy says something I couldn't quite make it out. You know, he says something about the $80,000. You know, it was kind of rapid. And so, but Wesley Muhammad continues, without incurring the debt that college education imposes on us. And when we get that degree, it has very little practicality. That's not a nation building skill, but a lot of us are running to get an African history degree. And I'm not disrespecting those who are experts who have their degrees in Africana Studies, but I would not, as conscious as I like to think that I am, and as pro-Black as I am, I would not recommend or even allow my children to pursue an African Studies or Black Studies degree in college. DJ Envy responds, for the youth out there, because this is a difficult situation. My daughter is 13. They're looking for majors and things to do. What degree would you suggest for kids that are trying to expand and trying to better and trying to build, trying to be better and trying to build? Because you go to college, and most of those kids don't know, they go communications because they hear radio and everything else, or they, and Wesley Muhammad interrupts, they want to be DJ Envy. And he chuckles a bit. DJ Envy continues, or business management or marketing or finance because they think they can run a hedge fund. What degrees do you think people should look toward? Wesley Muhammad responds, brother, we have to invest more in agriculture and the sciences. We have to invest in nation building skills. That's where we're at today. Look, family, every day on the news, this society is sending the strongest messages possible that we are not welcome here. And he continues and continues on that stream. He brings up the STEM fields, and but the bulk of what the conversation, at least this aspect of it, I have transcribed, here at this particular part. So there's a few things that we have to highlight. So one is the Africana Studies is a BS degree, a bullshit degree. Now he later comes on his own channel, or more should I say his Facebook page, his Facebook Live, and swears that he did not say or did not mean that Africana Studies is a BS degree, and that's exactly what he said. And so you can view it, you can transcribe it, saying yourself, that's what he said. And so Africana Studies being a BS degree, that it has very little practicality. It's not a nation building skill. And of course he would, encourage his children to do it, and a whole bunch of other things which, are at issue. So it's not shocking to me, especially coming from Dr. Wesley Muhammad, because there are, people were asking, you know, why would he isolate Africana Studies, you know, when DJ Envy asked him for an example of a bullshit degree. Of all the degrees, you know, why would he isolate Africana Studies? And so, you know, as a computer scientist, we're trained to look for patterns. And so I've noticed a pattern, not only with Dr. Wesley Muhammad, but with the Nation of Islam in general. And they tend to be anti-African, but pro-Black. And they're, you know, a larger discussion on that can be had at a different time. But, you know, here's an example of what I mean in terms of the rhetoric of Dr. Wesley Muhammad along these lines. And so, you know, this is what I transcribed from Dr. Wesley Muhammad, who a number of years ago, back in 2011, at the annual Nation of Islam Savior's Day, he was invited to speak, and, you know, less than 10 minutes into his discussion, he says this commentary. So he says, you know, and of course he's speaking to Muslims at the Nation of Islam Savior's Day. So he's saying that our children are being kidnapped. He used the word kidnapped by ideologies other than Islam, gangs, Afrocentricity, or the so-called culture of hip hop. We're losing our children to all of these other ideologies. Now, one has to wonder how Afrocentricity fits into this discussion, and how would you relate it to losing your children? It makes sense when you understand that Islam itself is essentially anti-African, and they have waged war on African culture and ideologies. You know, this is evident in the, you know, you can find it on the net as well, when, you know, Farrakhan was, you know, having a speech and argued that based on Elijah Muhammad's teachings that, you know, the black man is cursed, his phenotype is cursed, or is a curse from God because of not following, you know, basically his law, statutes, and commandments. And so because we were disfigured on the inside, as a punishment for our transgressions, God disfigured us on the outside, and so made our lips big, our nose wide, and our hair nappy. And so, you know, and we can go on to some examples from Elijah Muhammad, you know, and even Malcolm X had to acknowledge that the Nation of Islam is anti-African and not pro-African. And he said this in an interview. But this is a discussion, you know, for another day. So again, I'm not surprised that the first thing that comes out of his mouth is Africana Studies, because Africana Studies, you know, the home of Afrocentricity, is quote unquote the reason why they are losing their children in terms of these other ideologies. And so you have to keep this in mind. You have to keep this history and context together when you're looking at or listening to that video from the Breakfast Club featuring Dr. Wesley Muhammad. So one of the things that, and I, you know, disturbed me from the conversation is that, you know, there was nobody on the panel who had the wherewithal to be able to ask him some follow-up critical questions. And so, you know, the first question I would have asked, or one of the first questions I would have asked is, well, what is a nation and what is nation building? What do you mean by that? Because when you're able to define that, and then you would, of course, naturally have to ask about, well, what do you learn in Africana Studies, and how is it or is not it able to contribute to the concept of a nation and nation building? And so we're going to discuss that now. So this is one of those features that in all of the other, and I don't think that I've been able, of course, to listen to and read all of the responses to Wesley Muhammad, but this is one of the ones that I found lacking, or this is one of the issues that I found lacking in their responses, was an actual definition of what a nation is. So looking up with the word nation, we find that in common language, nation means a large group of people united by a common language, ancestry, history, or culture. Nationalism is the feelings people have of loyalty to their nation and pride in their national characteristics. A nation may also at times be called a country or a state, but actually a state is something a little different than a nation. A state can comprise of a nation, but a nation doesn't necessarily have to have any doesn't have to be associated with a particular state. And so there are a few characteristics of a nation, and that is a common postulated interrelationship, as mentioned before, a blood bond between members. This blood relationship may be actual, but more often is derived from myth. A shared cultural heritage. This heritage, and particularly the cultural artifacts and sometimes also institutional structures that it has created, represents the patrimony of the nation and is often invested with considerable sentimental value, to the extent that attacks on it are responded to with violent emotion. Linguistic coherence, in the form of one or more languages identified with the national identity. The more unique difficult these languages are, the stronger the emotional attachment to them as something that must be defended. In the world of mass telecommunications and the omnipresence of English as a lingua franca, for example, bitter struggles are taking place all over the world to protest the national languages, most notably in Iceland and France. A sense of identification by members with the nation. The idea of national affiliation is a deep-rooted one in a human psyche, and members of a nation suffer a very visceral response to any threat against it, real or perceived. So a common postulated interrelationship, a shared cultural heritage, linguistic coherence, and a sense of identification by members with the nation. So fundamentally, it's just a nation is more so a formal and solidified relationship between people. So we have to keep this in mind. And so there's a fundamental relationship to, but a sharp difference between a nation and a state. So a state then may be defined as an institutional structure charged with exercising authority within a definable jurisdictional purview, which is often territorial in nature. What does that mean? Characteristics of a state: has a monopoly on the exercise of force, legitimacy as perceived by the governed, institutional structures established to handle governmental tasks, including but not limited to the exercise of force, control over a territory, absolute or partial. So part of, the establishment of a nation, of course, is having land and boundaries. And of course, having a recognized governmental structure. And so a nation doesn't necessarily have that. A nation can exist without there being a formal governmental structure. They're just all related to culturally. But ultimately and eventually, the goal for any nation is the state. So they're ultimately related, just ultimately stages of each other, just different stages of a process, so to speak. So now that we have an idea of what a nation and what a state is, we must fundamentally now look at what Africana Studies is, its purposes and its functions. And so, it's disturbing that Dr. Wesley would argue that it has no practical value and that it has no, or it doesn't afford those who have degrees in it any nation building skills. When anybody who was involved in Africana studies understands and notes that nation building is one of the essential features of Africana studies. And so we even have text on nation building and what is involved in that process. So this is taken from the text, The African American Studies Reader, edited by Nathaniel Norman, this particular instance here. And so, you know, we first got to understand what is Africana Studies and what it intends to do and does. And so discussing Africana Studies in general, he goes on to say that as in any academic, social, political, or intellectual endeavor, there is no single purpose that drives the field of African American studies. And so, and I should stop right here. You'll see that what we call Africana Studies is named differently in different departments. So you'll see Africana Studies, African American Studies, African Studies, Black Studies, and things of that nature. So they'll all be used interchangeably in this discussion. However, its main purposes should be, one, to analyze, produce, investigate, and disseminate knowledge about African people, number one. Number two, to involve and incorporate the content, ideologies, and methodologies of African American studies in all aspects of the community. So regardless of what you're doing in the nation or in the community, Africana Studies shapes how people think and behave within those fields. Three, to prepare undergraduate and graduate students with knowledge, skills, and paradigms to analyze critically factors which affect African people in America. And four, to identify issues and problems African Americans face and to provide leadership and solutions to resolve them. If I go too fast or whatnot, remember that you will be able to pause this and analyze this, you know, at your own pace. And so there's really no singular definitive description of Africana Studies or Black Studies, but over the years, people have been able to define it so you get the underlying gist of what it is and what it deals with by dealing with these various texts. So from this point on, I'm gonna be naming some text and some quotes about what Black Studies, Africana Studies, African history, all of that is as far as an academic discipline. So this text here by Nathan Hare, Questions and Answers About Black Studies, in the Massachusetts Review states, the main motivation of Black Studies, this is in 1969. And remember that, you know, Black Studies, African Studies really came into the forefront in the 60s as a result of the civil rights movement of young students demanding that we are able to study ourselves at the university level and that we have Black teachers teaching the courses and that it comes from a Black perspective. And so, you know, so there's lots of literature on the development of Africana Studies and the issues that they were facing and things of that nature. So these texts come out of that era and that evolution of the development of Black studies departments and programs across the country. So the main motivation of Black Studies is to entice Black students to greater involvement in the educational process. Black Studies is above all a pedagogical device. So it encourages and teaches students how to get involved, you know, politically, economically, etc., in their communities. It shapes their minds and influences their behavior to be attached to the nation and to improve and work on behalf of the nation. Vivian Gordon in her article, The Coming of Age of Black Studies, in the Western Journal of Black Studies, states, the curriculum, thus the subject matter of Black Studies, must help the student develop his or her skills in the use of tools which are important to both a critical analysis of interaction of the past and present, and to the student's future participation in the analyses of factors which affect the life of Black people in America. Again, it's to strengthen and inform students on how to properly engage in the issues in the world once they graduate, having a particular type of mindset, you know, to be more effective in what they're doing in their everyday endeavors in the community. Inez Reed, in an analysis of Black Studies programs, an article in the Afro-American Studies 1970s, suggested 4 purposes that assume prominent roles in the debate over African-American studies. So these are the 4 main purposes, according to Reed, of African-American studies or Black studies. Black studies programs can fulfill, number 1, Black studies programs can fulfill a need for scholarly correction of historical and cultural myths. 2, Black studies can provide potential elementary and secondary school teachers destined to serve in Black communities with much more knowledge about African-American children. Number 3, Black studies can fulfill a psychological need on the part of Black students. And number 4, Black studies can fulfill the need to begin the process of re-socialization and socialization of African Americans destined to play roles in the United States in the 21st century. Number 2 is very important here. Black studies can provide potential elementary and secondary school teachers destined to serve in Black communities with more knowledge about African American children. Now, in order to have competent, culturally competent teachers in the inner cities who understand the students who they're teaching, they have to go through a process, they have to go through institutions that properly train them to do and engage successfully Black children. In order for you to do that, you're going to have African American studies degree granting programs at the university level, and you're going to have individuals getting their degrees in that to be able to go back, you know, saying, and teach all of the other subjects, you know, in a very Black and or African centered way, one that the students can one relate to, and better associate with the subject matter. And so this is one of those important things. So if you're building a nation, of course, you're going to have some kind of educational institute. So who is going to teach the curriculum in a way that is going to benefit, these Black children, if you don't grant degrees or you don't have people getting degrees in these subjects or whatnot, like we are doing today? It makes no sense. And so this is a very integral part of nation building, but more so nation maintaining, nation advancing. You're going to have to transfer knowledge from one generation to the next. So where are you going to get your qualified teachers from? Where are you going to get those qualified experts to even write the curriculum material that we could quote unquote go on our own and study without incurring the quote unquote debt of an Africana Studies? If you don't have a full scholarship, any subject you teach, you're going to have debt. That's the debt part is irrelevant. It's an investment, not only in yourself, but in your community. So I'm going to continue. James Stewart, in his article, Reaching for Higher Ground Toward an Understanding of Black and Africana Studies, 1992, has presented what 5 significant results and contributions of the discipline have been. Number 1, the destruction of the myth of the passive acceptance of subjugation by Blacks. Peoples of African descent have always attempted to shape their own destinies. 2, documentation of the critical role of collective self-help. In other words, agency in laying the foundations for Black progress. 3, the restoration of the record of accent and modern civilizations of blacks in developing high technology and establishing early civilizations in North and South America. 4, the exploration of the contemporary implications of psychic duality, building on Du Bois' classic formulation of the concept of Afrocentricity as a guiding principle. And people got to understand that Afrocentricity is older than Molefe Kete Asante. He's credited more so with institutionalizing Afrocentricity. 5, explication of the critical role played by Black women in shaping the Black experience. These are many, just a few of the contributions that the discipline has, brought about in the Black African world. Charles V. Hamilton, in his article, The Challenge of Black Studies, in the Social Policy Journal, 1970, after examining over 50 Black studies proposals and programs, he summarized Black studies as having 6 primary functions. 1, the gaps function, correcting the inadequacies of existing courses. So if you don't have degreed experts, how are we going to correct or how are we going to be taken seriously when we correct, the misinformation coming from the Eurocentric and Arab-centric camps, concerning African people. 2, the functional theory, to educate Black students for useful service in the Black community. So it's not enough to just do STEM. It has to be STEM in the service of Black people. But how do you get Black people to relate their knowledge in STEM for the service of the community? That's where Black studies, Africana studies comes in. And of course, you have to have degreed people in the subject of Africana studies for this to really be effective, especially at the university level. 3, the humanizing function, to help white students overcome racist attitudes by imparting new knowledge and new human values. 4, the reconciliation theory, to bring about a new spirit of cooperation between Blacks and whites. 5, the psychological function, to instill a sense of pride in Black students, to develop a sense of identity. And number 6, the ideological function, to serve as a means to develop new ideological third world orientations, to develop theories of revolution and what? Nation building. But, according to Dr. Wesley, it has no practicality. There's no nation building skills. But remember what a nation is. It's fundamentally a formalized interrelationship between people. How are you going to get a displaced people who don't see themselves in related to each other in meaningful ways to identify themselves enough to be able to act with agency for the betterment of themselves versus the betterment of, the Eurocentric American state or nation itself? You have to have an Africana Studies program, especially one that's involved in nation building, which the very nature of Africana Studies, that's its purpose. And so even within Africana Studies, you have within that more so the Afrocentric aspect of Africana Studies. And so nowadays it's called Africology. And so when you go to Temple University here in Philadelphia and you go to you get a degree in African American or Africana Studies, is under the banner of Africology. And so in Africology, first I want to, define what Afrocentricity is, which is a paradigm based on the idea that African people should reassert a sense of agency in order to achieve sanity. The Afrocentric paradigm is a revolutionary shift in thinking proposed as a constructural adjustment to Black disorientation, decenteredness, and lack of agency. And so when we talk about Africology, it is the study of the concepts, issues, and behaviors with particular bases in the African world, diasporan and continental. In other words, it is the Afrocentric study of African people. And so just because you read and talk about Black people don't mean that you're Afrocentric. And so Skip Gates, is a perfect example of what we mean here. He talks black, he talks about black people, but he does not have an Afrocentric worldview. He doesn't speak from the point of view of the people. You know, but that's another topic at another time. And so, you know, we're going to continue on this idea of Africana studies not being practical or involved in this process of nation building. And so we have texts that deal with all of this. And you can tell that Wesley Muhammad has not taken Africana studies. Of course, his degrees are in Islamic and religious studies. So he hasn't been involved in Africana studies. So he doesn't know what the subject matter is, what the focuses are. He doesn't know the relevant text. And so one of the relevant texts dealing with African-centered education is by Kwame Agye Akoto, which is titled Nation Building, Theory and Practice in African-Centered Education. The whole book is titled Nation Building, Theory and Practice, and this is one of those required readings in Africana study circles. This comes out in 2002. I'm just going to read, you know, a little bit of this, and some of this, and most of this is cited as well for those who don't have that text, but you have Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. It's in that text, I think, starting on page 130 or something like that. So, in his text, he says, African-centered education is rooted in the unique history and evolved culture of African people. It is defined in a singular commitment to the elucidation of that history, that culture, and the confirmation, invigoration, and perpetuation of the African collective identity that emanates from the history and the culture, from that history and culture. African-centered education is concerned with the origins, current status, and the future of the African world. African-centered, let me go back. Okay. African-centered education is committed to correcting the historical distortions born of 3 millennia of foreign invasion, destruction, enslavement, physical and mental colonialism, cultural disruption, and dependency. African-centered education is committed to rooting or anchoring the spiritual and intellectual energies of African people in the spiritual, moral, and philosophical traditions of Africa, meaning we're grounded, all of our work is grounded in the cultures of Africa, and we operate from that grounding. African-centered education, whether in the several nations of the diaspora or on the motherland, is concerned to fully develop the sense of African nationality within a broader Pan-African world. African-centered education is concerned to sever irrevocably the pathological and Slavish linkage of Africans to the European or Asian ethos. African-centered education is concerned to enable the African person with nation building, nation management, and nation maintenance abilities. African-centered education is concerned to motivate teacher, student, parent, and community to advance the African nation world by any means necessary. The historical and ideological currents. The future of the African world must begin with a confirmed sense of African nationality, defined within the universe of African spiritual, moral, and philosophical traditions, and committed to the material and spiritual development and independence of the African world. Only an unambiguously African-centered education is possibly accomplished, can possibly accomplish this goal. African-centered education is to be distinguished from the current educational philosophies being employed in independent African nations and national enclaves in the Americas, Asia, the Pacific, and Europe. African-centered education rejects the implicit and explicit superiority of European and Asian intellectual, political, or spiritual traditions that characterize the systems of the former colonial colonies, dependencies, and slave populations of the African world. It rejects the false historical notion that Asian, Arabic, and European civilization rescued Africa from barbarism and godlessness. African-centered education seeks to restore the traditions of Africa to prominence to revitalize those traditions and imbue them with the liberating and progressive dynamics of what? Nation building. We're going to continue. Okoto's curriculum domain. In this text, he also talks about what he calls the African-centered thematic inventory, which is the recurrent themes and nationalist Pan-African theories of liberation and the philosophical foundation of the African-centered curriculum. We don't have time and space to deal with that, but what we're going to deal with is his curriculum domains. In other words, you know, remember that Africana Studies is an academic discipline on at the university level. And so you can't have a discipline without curriculum. So what does that curriculum include? So that's what we're talking about in terms of the curriculum domains. Provide the basis for the organization of the subject matter within a prototypical African-centered curriculum. The cultural domains are broken down into 5 primary domains with these sub-components of those domains. So the first is the cultural ideological domain. And so culture and ideology and creativity is the subcomponents. 2, the spiritual psychoaffective domain, which deals with self-knowledge, ethics, and morality. But let's talk about this number 3 real quick. Socio-political and economic. The subcomponents of this domain include political economy, cognition and inquiry, technology, mathematics, sciences, computer sciences. Wait a minute. I thought those weren't aspects of Africana Studies. But these are supposed to be the practical STEM aspects of education that we aren't going to and that we don't focus on, allegedly. I'm wondering where Dr. Wesley got his information from when discussing Africana Studies and to include it in his quote unquote list, which he only listed 1 in terms of BS or bullshit degrees, but then talks about we should go into agriculture and the sciences and STEM, but that is part of the Africana Studies curriculum. And it's interesting because I also do graphic design as part of my offerings in terms of software and web development. And I just completed not too long ago for a couple who are African Americans who have repatriated back to Ghana and have started a school, and they're African-centered, and it's an African-centered educational institute in Ghana. And the flyer is for a summer program which teaches children 6 to 12 STEM fields as part of the African-centered educational paradigm. Domain number 4, technology. Here we go again. Mathematics, science, computer science, functional skills. These are the domains, the curriculum domains of Africana Studies, especially African-centered Africana Studies. And lastly, nation building, practical applications, career development apprenticeships, research theory and practicums, community development projects, organizational experiences. Where are we getting this idea that Africana Studies has no practical value and no nation building skills? Again, he was speaking from a position of ignorance of Africana Studies because he's not involved in Africana Studies. He's involved in teaching, you know, Islamic mythology. Totally different from Africana Studies. When you read Afrocentricity, Molefe Kitty Asante, 1988, page 50, he talks about the cultural aspect of Afrocentricity and what's involved in it. And he says, indeed, culture is the most revolutionary stage of awareness. That is, culture in the sense that Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon, and Malana Karenga have written about. This is at the macro level of education and includes science, music, engineering, architecture, dance, art, philosophy, and economics. When we move away from an Eurocentric framework, we become more innovative. We know that it is difficult to create freely when you use someone else's motifs, styles, images, and perspectives. Thus, the Afrocentric awareness is the total commitment to the African liberation anywhere and everywhere by a consistent, determined effort to repair any psychic, economic, physical, or cultural damage done to Africans. Africana Studies touches on all domains of the African human experience, which includes the sciences, engineering. See, these texts that I'm typing are written before STEM was a buzzword or a buzz acronym. Remember what I said about nation building. It's about building a relationship with people. And if you don't have that relationship, you can't build a nation. That's the first start. So this is one of the main benefits of Africana Studies. Africana Studies is the basis for building, for nation building. And so we have this text here, the falsification of African consciousness, Eurocentric history, psychiatry, and the politics of white supremacy by Dr. Amos Wilson. He says something here that's very important that people seem to miss, you know, because we always want to talk about economics, but we're always trying to put the economic cart in front of the cultural horse. It is culture that is the basis of power, which is why Dr. Amos Wilson in his Blueprint for Black Power, Chapter 3, titled it The Social and Cultural Origins of Power. Why does Cheikh Anta Diop in his book Black Africa, an economic and cultural basis for a federated state, title it as such? Because the culture is the basis. And so one of the main features of Africana Studies is to re-socialize them into the culture so that they have a sense of attachment to each other so they can utilize their skills in the maintenance of each other. So what Amos Wilson says in this text, 1993, page 44, we're suffering from the absence of an economic system. Money is not a system. Money is what it is. A system involves the systematic and organized utilization of money, a systematized utilization and distribution of money. Without the pattern, without the system, without the organization, one does not have an economy. An economy exists prior to money. There were economies, and this is important because it seems like the Nation of Islam really just want to be Arab capitalist. And so not understanding what is at the basis of an economy. I'll continue. There were economies in the world before money was invented. We don't even have to have money to have an economized system. So ultimately, when we study an economic system, we recognize that an economic system at its base, nature of the relationship between what? People. It's the systematic way people choose to relate to one another that makes an economic system, not money. When we lack a systematic way of relating to each other, then we can have money and still be poor, have money and be robbed, which is what we are. So to try to bypass Africana Studies and go into quote unquote money-making fields and expect that to be the basis of one's nation building is erroneous. And again, operating from a standpoint of ignorance of how nations are being built. You have to get the people to relate and vibe with one another. This is one of our challenges, being the victims of the transatlantic slave holocaust and Jim Crow and European white supremacy. This is one of the things that we're trying to counter. And this is one of our strategies and methods by having these programs in the institutions. So even for those who don't want to pursue its degree, they have access to the classes so they can learn these things. So whatever they are involved with, they can learn and be attached to their culture and learn the history and the issues involved and how they got to where they got and how they can utilize those skills for the betterment of their people. This is the benefit and basis of Africana Studies. that so-called BS degree. He continues on page 45. Why do we suffer from this problem then? Why is it that the Black personality created? Why is it the Black personality created? I try to get across the fact that every maladjusted characteristic in the Black personality serves an economic function. Each maladjustive characteristic is not there by accident. It's not there simply because Europeans hate us. It's there because it maintains their economic dominance. If I've got money, I can help you, but if I distrust you, I won't help you and you won't make it. It's not just the presence of mistrust. If I will not cooperate, if you cannot rely on me, then we cannot have an economic system, even though we may have money. In other words, if people must trust, be reliable, be dependable, have respect for each other, if they are able, or if they are to develop a viable economic system. When they have those kinds of relationships, they have a social system and they can build and they can grow economically. So Africana Studies, in part, again, is trying to repair those relationships. But how did those relationships get severed in the first place? Because of our experience. And if the people don't know it's because of our experience with Europeans and Arabs, then they won't understand why they're in the condition and why they don't look to other Black people and support Black people and Black businesses. You have to build the relationship first. This is one of the reasons why, and I'm not trying to, advertise for myself, but since I'm one of those STEM field graduates who's also involved in Africana Studies, who contributes in Africana Studies, I took African and African American Studies as minors. I double minored at the University of Houston and continued to advance studies after that, and of course contribute to the field. So one of my contributions is Where is the Love? How language can reorient us back to love's purpose. Taking that idea from Dr. Amos Wilson, I wanted to address this concept of love. And so what does love mean from the African perspective? And so it started off as a linguistic exercise, which turned into the transition of understanding what love is in relationships, the purpose of relationships from an African perspective, and how that is important to nation building. This is a nation building text that is involved with trying to repair and give people insight into the nature of relationships from the African perspective, and how that without that strong sense of relationship, that strong sense and understanding of what love is, you will never build a nation, a successful, at least one that is maintained a long term. So if you want to live for eternity, you got to build for eternity, and you have to have a strong foundation. The next book I written, and what's interesting is I wrote that book originally in 2013 after the Eluja book, but it was in ebook fashion. So in 2015, I added a little more and published it in hard book. So that's 2013, 2015. So in 2016, I wrote this text, Nesubiti, King and Ancient Egyptian, a lesson in paronymy and leadership. Again, I like to deal with linguistics as a way of penetrating the African psyche and trying to understand what is meant by a leader, what are the characteristics and what are their obligations from an African standpoint, using the Nesubiti, the word for king in ancient Egyptian, as a case study. But of course, expanding and looking at the cognates and the shared cultural and psychic, ideological perspectives as it pertains in practices, as it pertains to leadership in Africa. Because one of the crises that we have is bad leadership. Well, if you don't have models, if you don't have an articulation of what great leadership is, and you don't have those texts available for people to read, then they don't have anything to aspire to. It's a hit and miss thing. And so we don't take chances in Africana Studies. We build the text, we create the text, and we build the institutions for what we need in the nation. And so that's one of my contributions as well to nation building and understanding what is involved in the nation. Again, Africana Studies. And so why is this relationship important? Why is this sense of relationship important? How did these relationships get severed in the first place? I would like to give an example of an individual by the name of Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. This is a portrait of him that was done in London. Now, for those who don't understand or know who he is, he was a Gambian prince who was sold into slavery by rivals. When he was captured, however, he was on his way to sell his own slaves and buy paper. Now, he is a Muslim. He is a Muslim prince in Gambia. And so what you see around his neck is a handwritten Quran, because and he memorized the Quran. So he was educated, he memorized the Quran. And when he was out there picking cotton and things of this nature, they noticed that he wasn't, quote unquote, a regular slave, that he was very, very well educated and things of this nature. So a Thomas Blewett, who was a lawyer, helped to free Ayuba and brought him to London. He was out here in Massachusetts in the States, or Maryland in the States. And he stayed in London for about a year, then went back to Senegambia. However, he continued to trade enslaved Africans, and he struck a deal with the Royal African Company to broker the freedom of any Muslim slaves who fell into their hands. So he didn't learn anything as a result of his enslavement. He took it upon himself and his psyche that he wasn't related to any of these groups of these slaves, of these enslaved Africans. And so when he got his freedom, the first thing that he does is he gets back into the slave trading game and brokers a deal that only Muslims, you know, with the African company, the Royal African Company, that if they are Muslims, to release them. And so when you understand this aspect of African history, you can understand how a lot of us came over here as Muslims, because the idea was that Muslims couldn't be enslaved, because around this time it was Muslims who was doing mainly all of the capturing of enslaved Africans. And so the belief was, if I become Muslim, then I won't be enslaved. But you have these black Muslims who have no sense of connection to the people, involved in the slave trade, selling Africans into slavery. And one gets caught himself in the middle of enslaving, selling slaves, selling Africans who were captured, and then he gets released. And so instead of having a different mindset and attitude towards slavery, he reverts back to the ideology of the Quran, which of course allows slavery. And so you see the same attitudes in the biblical tradition, because in Exodus, it talks about how, of course, when they were allegedly enslaved, talking about the Israelites, for 400 years, you would think that they would have some kind of sympathy and for enslaved people, and would have as a policy that they would be against slavery. But no, as soon as they get out, you know, God gives them commandments on enslaving, you know, other people, but they had a rule that they couldn't enslave each other. So they got involved with the slave trade, you know, and talking about the Israelites. And so, you know, it's these kind of ideologies that Afrocentricity and Africology was created to combat, because we can't create a nation and we can't sustain a nation when you have people with these types of ideologies, because these type of people will sell you out for their own personal gain. And so, you know, part of this is creating an African identity and abolishing any kind of anti-life frame of thought and systems. This is Africana Studies. And so, you know, as an Africologist, you know, we are trained to ask critical questions. And so let's just say, for example, that the white man was eliminated and the Nation of Islam rose to power in America, that they're the most organized and they're the most prepared to run the nation at this moment. What would life be like under a Nation of Islam government? If you practice a different religion other than Islam, that's supposed to be what? What is your fate under a Nation of Islam regime? What kind of economic structure would they implement and enforce? Are they just going to be the black, white capitalists? Or do they have a different system, economic system in mind? What would happen to the idea of freedom of speech under a Nation of Islam run government? These are the things that you have to think about when people of the Nation of Islam talk about nation building, because they are in the business of creating a nation, yes, but a nation of Islam. And we just seen an example of what, the leadership under a Nation of Islam could possibly do, being grounded in Islam and not in the best of African traditions. These are the critical questions that we ask. And so, again, when you understand all of this, it's no wonder that Wesley Muhammad, in his 2011 Savior's Day speech, and I repeat this again, that our own children are being kidnapped by ideologies other than Islam, gangs, Afrocentricity, or the so-called culture of hip-hop. We're losing our children to all of these other ideologies, and they're going to continue to lose children if you consider Afrocentricity as an ideology that's kidnapping and you're losing children. You're going to continue on this because Afrocentricity is logically based. It is scientifically based and grounded. And we're going to have to expand that conversation on in another episode or discussion. So, one of the things that I find myself fighting against is this concept we call agnotology. And, agnotology is a study of the culturally induced ignorance or doubt, particularly the publication of inaccurate or misleading scientific data. And, I put this, this discussion or this argument put forth by Wesley Muhammad is in the agnotological domain, trying to promote ignorance for one's own selfish and ideological gains. And so I'm now going to go to the second part, of this discussion. Now, in 2017, February 2017, I think it was February, Dr. Wesley Muhammad released this. He did a soft release of this book called Ra is Allah, Why Asar Imhotep is Wrong. Now, this is in response to this book that you see here on the left-hand side that I wrote back in, or I published back in 2013, called Illuja, Rescue, Interpretation, Reinterpretation, and the Restoration of Major Ancient Egyptian Themes, Volume 1. And in this text, I wrote 2 articles, so it's 2 chapters, dedicated to a statement that Wesley Muhammad made in his 2009 work, Black Arabia and the African Origins of Islam, where he made the argument that the god Ra was an import by Black Semites, and that Ra was the Egyptianization in terms of pronunciation of the god Allah. And so my response, which was actually published earlier than this. So this first book is actually old articles that I just happened to put in book form for people to have in one spot. And so it was just published in 2013, but I actually wrote the original article way back in like 2010, 2011, something like that. So so his response is Ra is Allah, Why Asar Imhotep is Wrong. And actually he wrote 2 articles prior to that, to this publication, addressing my stance in Illuja, or my stances in Illuja. And in that text, he stated that there was actually, these are 2 of 3. So there was supposed to be a 3rd article, And so I'm saying this because, as I mentioned earlier, Wesley Muhammad did a follow-up video to the discussion that he had on the Breakfast Club. And in that discussion, on his Facebook Live page, he promotes this book. So again, the book has been out, but because he's promoting his other book, he ain't really did no hard advertising on this text, on the ra.w text. Only people who were at Savior's Day got a copy of this book. And so I've actually had this book for a minute. And so in his statement, he said that, you know, I haven't responded to him. And the reason why I haven't responded is because he, quote unquote, ethered me in this Ra is Allah, Why Asar Imhotep is Wrong book. So the reason why I haven't responded, again, because the articles that he wrote beforehand, he said that it was going to be a third article. And so I'm waiting for the complete argument before I respond, because that's the scholarly thing to do. You wait for their entire argument. So instead of coming out with the third article, he just puts the two articles that he wrote prior and puts it in book form with the addition of another article which he wrote in preparation for, which are basically notes for another book where he's dealing with Ifa and Islam, you know, being sibling rivals, something to that nature. So he includes those three articles, and that is really makes Ra is Allah, Why Asar Imhotep is Wrong. So I'm just waiting on the publication. And so I've been had it, the Ra is Allah, prior to him, you know, really officially mentioning it in his Facebook Live video. And because beforehand you couldn't buy it on his website, or was it on Amazon or anything to that nature. So you had to go through other means, through the A-Team and ATL to actually get the book. So again, I've read it already. A response is in preparation. It should be done sometime this fall, and it's actually going to be included as a chapter in my next book, Alluja Volume 2. So I'm not going to, you know, do like Wesley Muhammad and dedicate a whole book to him. But, you know, there will be some significant pages addressing, you know, what is in that text. And so I just want to address a few claims, only a few. It's not that many, because I'm saving the bulk of it for the actual text. And so, you know, for those who have the book or those who don't have it yet, to kind of get a sense of the quality of scholarship that is in it, and what you can expect. And so that's why I have the question mark ethered, because in my personal opinion, the book was poorly done. And you'll see why when I do my response. And so here are some preliminary errors in Muhammad 2017. And so there are a few things that you'll notice throughout. So I'm just going to give one example of each of these preliminary errors. And there's more that I could add, but I'm not trying to make this video too long. And so, and one is ghost arguments. And ghost arguments are what I call arguments that, you know, that people argue against that a person has not made. So this is a spook argument, an argument that doesn't exist. And so Wesley Muhammad makes several arguments in his text that I don't even make. And but he's arguing against them as if I made them. And so, for example, on page 8, Dr. Wesley says, while I claimed in 2009 that the name of the Egyptian sun god Ra shows a rotarization of an original L, therefore the name's original L turned into R in Egypt, Imhotep claims that the Egyptian Ra is an original R root, and that this R root has the original meaning of fire, burn, sun. He even claims that the L of Allah derives from the R of the Yoruba term Orisha, thus lateralization. There's nowhere in my text where I made that argument. This is exactly what I said. In Aluja, Volume 1, 2013, page 80. There is a concept in linguistics called directionality. The known directionality of certain sound changes is a valuable clue for reconstruction. Directionality notes that some sound changes which recur in independent languages typically go in one direction, for example, A to B. However, this type of change is usually not found in the other direction, sometimes never. Therefore, for example, it's supposed to be, for example, B to A. Many languages have, for example, many languages have changed S to H, but the change in the other direction is almost unknown. Therefore, H to S. In cases such as this, if we find two related or sister languages, the sound correspondence with the sound correspondence S in language 1 and H in language 2, then we reconstruct S and postulate that in language 2, S became or changed into H. So that's what that arrow stands for. The reverse is highly unlikely since it goes against the known direction of change. It is with this knowledge that we know that Orisha is the earlier form of Ilah in Edo or Liha, because the directionality of S to H. We can witness this phenomenon in Semitic where the RS root for head morphs into RH in the following languages. In Mehri, hero is the word for head. So if you know about the word for head in Semitic is, Ras, like in Rastafari. It's a word for head. And so the word Ras is cognate with the word Orisha. So in my my 2013 argument, I argue that Allah is cognate with the word Orisha in the Yoruba language. I did not argue that Allah derives from Orisha, just that Orisha has the earlier pronunciation, and we can tell because of the directionality, of the sound change. So I didn't discuss anything about the R in Orisha in relationship to the L in Allah. It's a ghost argument. It's non-existent. You're not going to find it in my text. And then there's some more added on to this, and it builds off of this. But there's no way in the world that I even made this argument, which is why he didn't quote me saying it, because I didn't make the argument. So he makes these ghost arguments. And so my stance has even changed today. I no longer argue that Orisha is the cognate of Allah. And matter of fact, I argue now that Orisha is actually a loan word into the Yoruba language from a language akin to the Igbiroid or Ibiroid language. We know it as Igbira or Ibira, which is in like northern Nigeria. And so it's a related language, but it's not, close in terms of, with Yoruba or whatnot. So they're distantly related, but related languages. And so when you actually look at, and I should back up a little bit, what I argued in 2013 is that the word Allah is ultimately related to a Congo-Saharan word for head, which then is metaphorically extended to mean up or higher, which is also used in the words in African languages for heaven. Words for heaven is just a word for head. And so in these become words for God ultimately. And we see that a lot in African languages. So that was my argument in 2013. But when we examine further, like the related languages, we see a pattern here. So like for the primary word for head in the Yoruba language is Ori. And Orisha means head, but it's never used as a word for head in the Yoruba language. It's only associated with the concept of deity, which is a key word. So it's non-analyzable. And I also argue that the root was Ori in Orisha. I no longer believe that. I know now that the root of the word for head in Orisha is the sha in Orisha. the ori or the re part is actually a lexicalized grammatical morpheme for that denotes body parts. And so that is absent in the Yoruba language. And so in the Yoruba language, if you look on the right, we have ori, head. We have Igbo, isi, head. We have Twi, et, head. They all belong to the same group of languages. And in Proto-Bantu, you have Tui, head. The reconstruction is actually for a T sound, and which becomes C in Igbo and Ri in Yoruba. And the R in other languages become, and actually in Yoruba, you could say Ori or Oli, because there's a liquid interchange in Yoruba in some dialects. And so this one, you know, and I'll deal with this more in the book, this linguistic aspect, because this shows that he doesn't know anything about linguistics, and he just hurried up and read some things to try to make a response to me, because he's arguing that the R in the Yoruba, for example, and or the Egyptian derives from a rotarization of the L sound, and not knowing that the R could come from many different sounds. It can come from S, it can come from T, it can come from K. And so unless you actually do the work, you won't know. So Wesley Muhammad all throughout the book is guessing. He's doing lookership, what we call in the squad lookership. If it looks alike, he rolls with it. And that's not how linguistics work. And so we see here, for example, in the Ibira language, Ireso, head. And this combination here, this SCNC stands for Southern Central Niger Congo. And so it's reconstructed toe, head. And so in this language here, and in languages related to it, the R sound retains the grammatical feature to denote body parts. And so for example, some more examples in this language, Irinu, mouth. The root is Central Niger Congo, new, mouth. And I went into a dictionary from the source that I got this from, and found other examples. So we have Iriva, breast, Irare, tongue. And so this same feature is in the ancient Egyptian language, which is the nasalized uvular trio. But in Egyptian, the grammatical feature or the grammatical morpheme is suffixed instead of prefixed, like we find in this so-called Niger Congo language. And so what I state now is that I think the fuller form can be found as a reduplication in Egyptian as the word jur. That I don't even know if my mouse shows up on your screen, but this sound here is actually an R sound. It's a nasalized uvular trio. So this is a J-R. It's reduplicated, meaning head. Yoruba R derives from T. You can see the older forms in Twi, Eti, head, and Proto-Bantu, Tui, head. In Egyptian, T and G alternate, and it explains its true cognate in Yoruba because all traces of this nasalized uvular trio are lost in Yoruba. This is a suffix in Egyptian that denotes body parts. The proto-phoneme for Yoruba R is J, and it's more likely what Mboli in 2010, page 234, reconstructs as tree. So from tree comes this nasalized uvular trio, which is an R sound, and the same thing, the R sound that comes in the Yoruba language. And we can do comparisons between, for example, Twi and Bantu with Yoruba, and you will see T words that begin with T in Bantu and in Twi is a R sound in the Yoruba language. So, you know, which is closer to Proto-Bantu Tui, head. So Mboli's reconstruction of Twi for head, which is actually just a word for body parts in general, is very close to what other linguists have reconstructed for Bantu Tui, head. And so the Chiena into Negro Egyptian reconstruction is given as Twi Kwai or Kwau, you know, head. And so this Kau right here is that suffix for body parts. And from that Ka, you know, with that that I sound behind it, it what we call palatalizes into tree, you know, and becomes these sounds over here. So I'm gonna move on. Number 2, lack of knowledge of the subject, thus misreads source material. And so you're going to find in a lot of his texts, and this is not just this text, he has a habit of misreading source material. And so one of those is this, you know, on this page. So in discussing this word for ulu, because we're still on this subject of head, and you know, and remember what I mentioned earlier, that the concept of head also derives from this notion or derives notions of up or upper or top, and so which lead to sky and of course God. And so he says, we have already discussed the many problems of Imhotep's attempt to trace the Semitic languages back to Niger-Congo. This has no support. Regarding the Niger-Congo, or which is Niger-Saharan, Alu, Edgar A. Gregerson does reconstruct it, and Dietrich H. Westerman proposed Lu, head, for Niger-Congo. Christopher Eric proposed Nilo-Saharan, Lau, and Le, to rise, to go higher. On the other hand, Joan F. von Oort argued forcefully against it in his Origin of Bantu, 1907. And so he cites this text, and I'm about to cite him directly now. So Oort, Origin of Bantu, 1907, page 80 through 81, states, I strongly doubt whether originally this li or lu were really prefixes. In several Bantu languages, they do not exist at all. It may thus fairly be concluded that as this lu is not a general Bantu prefix, like most other prefixes, it has a foreign origin. In Arabic and in several of the so-called Hamitic languages in the northeast of Africa, we can find an article composed of a vowel and an affix and an affixed and a sometimes prefixed l. In classical Arabia, we have el. In Masai, we have o, masculine plural il. And in Bardi, we find lo, probably due to metathesis. There can be little doubt, but at a very early period of the Bantu invaders of Africa came into contact with these Hamitic races. The Ugro-Altaic Bantu, and so this author is arguing that you know, ultimately these Bantu languages arrived from Asia. That's another topic for another day. Had this definite article, which was originally a, but which, in accordance with the ancient vocalic harmony of which we still find part preserved in Bobangi or Bobanji, could be e, I, o, or u. When the Bantu came into close contact with the Nilotic, Hamitic, and Maasai tribes, their language was to some extent affected. So it happened that in some of the Bantu languages, the original article underwent a change and added to it is vowel, the lo or lu of the Hamitic languages. And thus we have the ilu or ulu of Zulu Kafar and the oru, r equals l, and olu of Herero, Oshidonga, and Oshikuwajama. One thing I can say about this text after reading the entire chapter, he doesn't demonstrate anything. This is a bunch of hypotheses, no demonstration of anything. And Wesley Muhammad, not understanding what he's arguing, just looks at it because it deals with the phoneme L and assumes that we're talking about the lu or ulu dealing with head and things of this nature that we was arguing beforehand. What he's dealing with here, again, is what we find out later, because this is in early Bantu studies. And so it's interesting that he doesn't cite any contemporary works dealing with Bantu languages. That lu and li is actually a prefix that deals with the body parts. So remember that the R in Orisha, the Ori and Orisha, in Bantu is li and lo. In Kikongo is D, and Chiluba is li lu. These are prefixes that denote body parts and abstractness. Dealing with, and you know, if you know anything about Bantu classifiers, this particular chapter of the book we just cited deals with, I think it's sections, hold on. Yeah, it's dealing with hold on, I'm gonna pull it up real quick on my other computer. is dealing with classifiers 5, 6, and 11. So mainly these are based on the 11 noun classifier category for those who are familiar with Bantu studies. And so, you know, as I said, Ort is talking about a Bantu noun class prefix and not a root. Two different arguments. This is old and pretty much outdated in terms of his arguments. And we know that these are prefixes mentioned are not definite articles. So, you know, him arguing about definite articles are irrelevant because these are not definite articles and they're not used as definite articles in the Bantu languages. These are in fact prefixes for parts of the body and abstractness. And if you know anything about the morphemes in Negro Egyptian languages, which I call Chiena into, these Negro Egyptian languages use the words for body part and specifically feet to denote the abstract. And so it comes from this root qui, where we get the word in Akan, inkwa, meaning life or person. In Kikongo, it's inkwa. In Egyptian, we pronounce it as unk, or you know, but it should be hankwa or hinkwa. In the Dualo language in Cameroon, they say hinga or hango, something to that nature. But you'll get more of that in the Aluja volume 2. But this is where we get the suffix for body parts from this qui in Negro Egyptian. So I give a few examples on the right of this in Bantu. So in Lingala, we have lo boko, arms, li soko, buttocks, li bali, liver, li toyi, ear, li no, tooth, lo limu, language, lo poso, in language dealing with mouth. So it's ultimately a word for mouth. Li poso, skin, li bolo, vagina. And in Chiluba, that word is actually used for penis. And that word also exists in Egyptian, also with the suffix of the R for the body parts, just like what we find in Bantu. Libumu, belly. And we also compare Likolo in Lingala for sky. And because it has this li in front of it, we know that Kolo ultimately was a word for body parts, just like the jur that we saw in the Egyptian language, which is a word for head. And so it comes from a word for head, and Likolo, you know, giving it the abstract concept is used in the term, is a body part term used, body part morpheme, grapheme used as a abstract, you know, grammatical feature. And so this concept of using words for body parts as grammatical features is also found in Bambara. So when we say kono bara, belly, or da bara, mouth, this suffix bara is used to denote body parts. And that word bara is a dialectical variation and probably the original in the Bambara language related to wolo, skin, and fadi, body. In the Nuer language, they also have this, but it's fossilized. And so, you know, it's this k, or this ik sound that is bolded is by the C in this word. So quick, side. In Egyptian, the cognate is gis, side. And so in Egyptian, we have several suffixes for body parts. So we have this R, or this nasalized volar trill, this R type sound here. We also have this j, and we also have S in Egyptian for as a suffix for body parts that are used for abstracts as well. So we have quick, side, lek, tooth, wick, above, lok, heart, dik, belly. You know, this is all a part of the Negro Egyptian grammatical structure, which ties these languages together. And so, you know, the Africanist linguists are kind of really sloppy when they do a lot of their comparisons. And so, you know, we have to go behind them and do the work. And so, you know, again, I'm a scientist. So demonstration beats conversation. You know, it's not enough to quote somebody because they're an alleged authority. You have to show where and how they demonstrate it. And so we demonstrate here this feature. Preliminary error number 3, incomprehensible logic. You're going to find a lot of this in Wesley Muhammad's works. especially in this Ra is Allah. So the example that, I'm going to show, here, hold on one moment. Let me go back here. Okay. So there's a chapter in there where he's dealing with the alleged relationship of Yoruba to Black Arabs coming out of Arabia, and that some of the Black Arabs coming out of Arabia migrated from Arabia into Yoruba land and created the Oyo Empire. So this is fundamentally this chapter and this particular argument. So as evidence of his argument, for a particular idea that the Yoruba, or at least a good significant amount of the Yoruba were Arabians and came out of Arabia, he cites this text concerning the Kano Chronicles. So we're talking about the Hassas. So the Hassas have a legend that they came out of Canaan, but this also falls into Muhammad misreading sources. So now I'm citing the source which Muhammad cites in dealing with the Kano Chronicle. And so it says the people, the Hassa ancestors, went up out of Canaan and settled in the land of Palestine. And a certain man among them named Najib, the Canaanite, went up out of Palestine with all of his household and journeyed westwards into Libya, which is one of the provinces of Egypt, and there dwelt for many years. All these he begat before they came to Dara. Now I have here bolded, went up out. Now here's Wesley Muhammad's explanation for what this really means. Now I'm citing Dr. Muhammad. If the reference was to Canaan, north of Palestine, the language went up out of Canaan and settled in Palestine is awkward at best, as we would expect a journey down from Canaan to Palestine. So, however, if the reference is to the original Canaan in West Arabia, the wording could be perfectly consistent with the original Canaanite northward migration to Syria, Palestine. So he's making the argument that Canaan is actually further south into Arabia and not above Palestine. His proof and argument for that is in that citation, which the author said that the Hassa ancestors went up out of Canaan and settled into Palestine. So his argument, his logic is that because the author said went up out, that automatically means that what he meant is that the Hassa people went up north to their destination, and not what the actual text means. And so this is just faulty logic all the way around, because went up out does not mean went north. It is no different than saying got up out of there. Doesn't mean I got up out of there and went north. When I say get up out my house, I don't mean to go out and go north. You get up, meaning you stand up and walk out. So they stood up and walked out and went to Palestine. They didn't go. There's no indication that they went up north and went to Palestine. It's just faulty logic and a misreading of the text. And so I don't know how he even put that to paper. And so, a few examples of what I mean of this wording. So we can even go into the Bible and hear this wording. And so, for example, in Matthew 3:16, as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was open, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. Doesn't mean that he got out the water and went north, wherever north was. He just got up out the water. Genesis 19:30. Then Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. And he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. Doesn't mean that he went up out of Zoar and went north. This is illogical. This has nothing. That is not what the concept of went up out means. It is equivalent to get up out. And it does not have any cardinal direction. It just means to stand up and go. But this is the level of scholarship that he allegedly ethered me with. So this is my last example, and y'all just have to wait for the text when I do the more complete scientific analysis. Misrepresentation of Imhotep's arguments. Now he goes all the way in, and claiming that I'm misrepresenting his arguments, and that is not the case at all. But there's a segment in there where I argue that the Semitic languages ultimately come out of Congo-Saharan. And I use Congo-Saharan only in the sense that it is closer to the reality of Negro Egyptian at this time. And so, quoting me on pages 37 and 38, he cites these statements from me. Semitic languages ultimately derive from Congo-Saharan languages. I said that. Imhotep. Many outsiders to African languages would think that Al or Allah is foreign or not native to African languages and solely is a Semitic phenomenon. And so I asked him, why wasn't there first an examination of African languages? So he interprets this and responds this way. Such a question clearly presupposes that for Imhotep, my discussion of Semitic phonemes does not qualify as an examination of an African language. Thus, despite the seemingly open admission to the contrary, one gets the vibe from reading this critique that Semitic is not an African phenomenon, or is at least not African enough. This is an error that must be corrected in order to fully appreciate many of the arguments and demonstrations that will follow. That wasn't my point. My point was, when you made the argument, I'm talking about Dr. Wesley Muhammad, that Allah was that Ra was Allah and was an import into Africa from the Semites, he just read some text that made the suggestion, that made a hypothesis, and he rolled with it as if they demonstrated it. Like they did some kind of scientific analysis and proven that Ra is a loan into the Egyptian language. And so as a result of that, knowing proper linguistic methods, I asked, well, why didn't you examine the other African languages? Meaning the languages surrounding it. You could examine Berber, you could examine the Chadic languages, you could examine the Nilo-Saharan languages that are right below ancient Egypt. You have to examine these languages and build sound meaning correspondences and establish sound laws to determine whether something is a loan or not. This was mentioned in the text. And so, let me see. And with the Congo-Saharan thing, even in my introduction, I'm using these terms loosely. Niger Congo, Nilo-Saharan, Afro-Asiatic, Khoisan. None of these are valid language groups, which is why I stated in the beginning, in the introduction of the book, the following. But what do you do when evidence supports the notion that the established boundaries for language categorization are in a sense arbitrary and non-existent? This is exactly the case as proposed by Oduyoye, Diop, Obinga, Bilolo, and Sambu, among others. They have been able to demonstrate relationships between African languages that extend beyond established boundaries. The Egyptian vocabulary, grammatical, cultural, and religious features betray the notion that Egyptian is a language family by itself as a sort of isolate among the Afrosan or Afro-Asiatic family of languages. Its affinities with Wolof, Dagara, Bantu, Collagen, and Yoruba alone defy the logic of such a categorization. The approach to spirituality and the name of the deities by the Egyptians alone would place it in Niger-Congo family of languages, given the criteria set out by Hermstein 2012 and Eric 2000. So you have to understand the previous conversation where, these two sources and more, I discuss how they categorize certain groups in terms of their culture and ideology and language. And so that's within that context. And so I continue with this. Obinga, 1993, has put together, in my opinion, a more realistic classification model other than what has been proposed by Greenberg, 1963. Obinga proposes 3 primary language families in Africa: Berber, Khoisan, and Negro-Egyptian. The Negro-Egyptian family would consist of Egyptian, Cushitic, Chadic, Nilo-Saharan, and Niger-Kordofanian. This would better explain the non-accidental shared features belonging to both Niger-Congo and Nilo-Saharan and the ancient Egyptian languages, for example. And so this is a schema, and this is from the book, and I'll just translate into English from French. The common origins of ancient Egyptian, Coptic, and the modern Black African languages. An introduction to the African historical linguistics. And so this is the schema of Obinga. So on the left side is Obinga, and the Greenberg is on the right. So Obinga, after doing his analysis, isolates Berber as its own language family, Negro-Egyptian, and Khoisan. And he puts Semitic outside of these language families. And so Greenberg has Afro-Asiatic, Nilo-Saharan, Niger-Kordofanian, and Khoisan. I will be dealing with all of this in Illuja Volume 2, so be patient. But this is the table of his Negro-Egyptian. And so we have Egyptian over here, Pharaonic Egyptian, Coptic. We have Cushitic. We have Chadic, Nilo-Saharan, and Niger-Kordofanian. Now, the concept of Niger-Kordofanian and Nilo-Saharan in earlier texts, have actually been joined. And also based on some work by like G.J. Campbell Dunn and others, we argue that the Semitic languages, come out ultimately of these language families, which we now call Negro-Egyptian. But, and so I dealt with that in my 2015 book, Where is the Love, which actually came out a few months later from Illuja. So remember that Illuja Volume 1 was old articles that I just put together for the book and created a book out of the old articles. The Where is the Love book builds on that, and I go full throttle with the Negro-Egyptian model. And so I dispense with Niger-Congo, Nilo-Saharan, Chadic, and I do the same thing for my 2016 book, Nesubiti. And so those who have those books know exactly what my stance is. And so I'm surprised he didn't, if this came out, remember, in 2017, that he hasn't read and cited me in those 2 texts, which have the updated classification schema from which I operate. But that's just a more up close from the book, scan from the book. And so what I argue is that Semitic is not an African language, although it borrowed heavily from African languages. The quote spoke to other African languages that are neighbors of Egypt to eliminate chance. Thus, Ra could have been borrowed, so for example, if we argued that Ra was a borrowing, he could have been borrowed from the Chadic languages. How do you know that it's a borrowing from Semitic versus any other language family? That's why you have to examine the other African languages, which is what I said. And that was the context in which I said it. And so in summary, in my opinion, the book is just full of bad methodology and sloppy linguistics. It is full of logical fallacies and misrepresentations of source material. And although Muhammad claims it to be 200 pages of straight ether, it fails to demonstrate anything using the comparative method or any of its claims. It's full of lookership. And when somebody comes on and names a book, Ra is Allah, why Asar Imhotep is wrong, and then comes out on video and says that he has created a 200-page book and that I haven't responded because he ethered me, quote unquote, you would expect better scholarship coming out of that text. And it's for reasons like this that we have to be humble when we do our scholarship, especially if it's scientific, because the basis of science, or to make an argument scientific, is that it has to be falsifiable. And so your information can be falsified at any time with better and new information. So you don't boast what you think you know about a subject. You approach this humbly. And so I just wanted to do this to show that, one should slow down when talking about matters for which they do not know. And this book here is a clear example of how not to do linguistics. So the article and the chapter for which I'm writing in Aluja is going to be called A Lesson in the Scientific Method, subtitled The Case of Allah. And so that's all I have. I think I'm right on time, just under 2 hours. So I'm going to end my sharing, and I'm looking now at the chat room. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to look at the chat room. Peace, Global African Tribalism, and Maquette, I see Lord Abba, Joshua, Libyan now, Jehudi Ma'at, Mukmuk, the General, the Hack, Lessie or Lisa Darcy, you know, and others. I'm just scrolling. Just want to thank y'all for you know, your commentary, for listening, and for all of those who are not participating, particularly in the chat, but who are listening live. You know, I want to thank you all as well. So if there are any questions, you know, y'all have commented long and strong in here, so I'm not sure I can catch any questions that y'all had beforehand. But if you have any questions, you know, now, you know, please type it in the chat. Or, you know, even if you don't catch it live, you know, you have a question, you could put it in the comment section, and hopefully I'll see it and come back. But if I don't see any questions, you know, I'll just end this video. So, you know, just hopefully I addressed some of the issues, and there's more issues, but, you know, we'll be here all day addressing some of the issues brought about from the conversation on the Breakfast Club, as well as the Ra is Allah book. So no, I'm not running from you, Wesley Muhammad. I was just waiting for you to release your text. I have it, and I've been had it for a while, and so a formal response is forthcoming. I have some other texts and research to do, so you know, this won't be finished until probably sometime in the mid-fall, and then hopefully after that, you know, we can, when that work is done, we can actually have a public discourse, debate, whatever you want to call it, you know, concerning this matter. And so people can see side by side the arguments, because we've been at this for a couple of years now. So I think it warrants some kind of public discourse. So, you know, that's up to you. I know you have made the argument that you're not debating anyone in the quote unquote conscious community anymore. So, you know, I understand if you don't, but it's an open invitation, and so I'm putting it out there. But let me see. Let's see, much appreciated. Thank you for your silence. Okay, there's no questions, so I'll just end it. So I appreciate everyone for listening. Thank you. Please share the video, leave your comments, questions. I'll try to answer them in a timely fashion. I'm not online as, you know, as strongly as I used to be back in the day, because again, I'm back in school. So, you know, STEM has me busy, you know, this summer. So thank you all for listening. Y'all have a blessed Sunday, and talk to y'all later. Salute.